Hi, everyone. I apologize for the asynchronous lecture today and the extenuating circumstances that Haley and I had and all the delays. But I think you'll enjoy today's lecture, and we have some activities for you to check out as well after if you're interested. So I'd like to start off with this notion that you may have heard of, that we are star stuff. And it's really powerful in kind of shifting our perspective as to what we really are and how connected we really are to each other, to our universe itself, because this notion that we are made of star stuff is actually scientifically accurate, right? Of course, everything that we see today, all the matter that we see today, is a product of a star explosion, which we'll talk about, and whatever physical process that originated from the Big Bang, right? So the Big Bang occurred arguably about 13.7 billion years ago, and these numbers are still in space. Some scientists are saying it's double that amount, but this is still currently the consensus for now. But our planet and all living things on Earth are made of matter, and most of this matter was created during the Big Bang. The rest of it created from the cores of ancient stars and stars exploding right now, creating new elements. But during the Big Bang, all the hydrogen and most of the helium, as well as the lithium in our universe, was created from subatomic particles that we know of, such as protons and neutrons, together called nucleons. And since they're, in the center, in the nuclei of atoms. But since protons and neutrons came together to make the nuclei of lighter elements, helium, hydrogen, lithium, during the Big Bang, we call this process Big Bang nucleosynthesis, right? And most of the hydrogen and helium was created in about 5 minutes, which is fascinating. And our current models of how the elements were formed tell us that all of the helium and hydrogen produced 5 minutes after the Big Bang was due to its cooling after initially being very heated. We also see that this cosmic microwave background afterglow here kind of gave us evidence for whether the universe was expanding or not. But once we have our lighter elements, these can come together and produce stars. So initially, these elements are kind of floating in stellar nebula, and they will either produce an average or massive star, and that'll go on to be either red giant or red supergiant, produce a smaller supernova called planetary nebula, or a complete explosion of the supernova as the star dies. Right. And again, this can either go on to become a white or brown dwarf star, a neutron star, if it's following the supernova, or into a black hole. But these stages of the stars are important for creating further elements past those 3 lighter elements that we know of. And of course, the reason we're talking about this is because life requires many key elements that are not possible without this process of star formation and star death, right? And so these first generation stars created just from helium and hydrogen, they burned out very quickly. And the cores of these first stars had the process of nuclear fusion, creating elements heavier than lithium finally. And hydrogen and helium were squeezed basically very tightly, that so much energy allowed stellar nucleosynthesis to take place. All right, I wrote that down, stellar nucleosynthesis. So when these initial stars created a few more heavier elements and eventually burned up all the fuel and, burst into a supernova, these heavier elements, dispersed into space and then created stars, new stars from those elements. And the heavier basically it goes is up into iron and nickel, which is formed in the cores. But otherwise, other key elements that were produced were oxygen, carbon, magnesium, silicon, and many of these elements are necessary for life. But interestingly, we see that it only goes up to iron, but after that, it basically takes too much energy to make elements any heavier than iron. So I'd like for you to think about where the energy might come from to make further elements heavier than iron, because of course we do have many other elements, but think about where we've been seeing that kind of energy take place, right? But overall, simple organic molecules, such as, some of the ones involved in the building blocks of biochemical pathways of life, are produced in space, right? And astrochemicists can use telescopes and observe a variety of organic molecules within the dusty clouds of our galaxy. So we also know that researchers have discovered organic molecules on the surfaces of comets and asteroids, and some astrobiologists working in laboratories can emulate that energetically dynamic condition in interstellar space by taking icy mixtures of water, methanol, carbon dioxide, ammonia, other simple compounds, expose them to UV light, UV radiation, such as would be exposed, by stars, and then see that they produce simple amino acids. So the building blocks of proteins, which are a key macromolecule, right? Polymer involved in all biological functions. So just to recap, right, for proteins, so there are large polymers of amino acids, which serve either structural roles or enzymatic roles to speed up reactions and aid in DNA replication, repair, metabolism, which just means, taking energy, using energy from food, and responding to stimuli, right? But overall, what we know and see is that chemistry that naturally occurs in space can lead to biologically relevant elements and molecules. And since these reactions are thought to be occurring, wherever new stars and planets are formed, this implies that amino acids could be introduced to the surfaces of any planet or moon. It's important to understand how the solar system formed and the planets formed, because of course these are the surfaces that are likely to harbor life, right? Our planets and moons rather than stars. But what nebular theory will tell us is that, again, this process of gravitational contraction, kind of clumping the cloud together, eventually will allow for the sun to develop and the planets to form around it. But before gravitational contraction, the majority of the material within this giant molecular cloud that formed our solar system consisted of hydrogen, helium produced at the time of the Big Bang, and then with heavier elements like carbon and oxygen being provided through nucleosynthesis of the stars in future generations of stars. So for example, our solar system is definitely not a first generation solar system. It's likely like a second or further generation of a star system that formed. So the material in this giant cloud was not normally distributed, and some regions were higher density than others. And evidence from meteorites suggests that the energy produced by a nearby exploding star, a supernova, passed through a higher density region in the cloud and caused it to swirl and twist. And this is kind of called like a pre-solar nebula. So as molecules in this pre-solar nebula were swirling around, some of them were bumping into each other and would even stick together, and more would clump, and gravity would cause them to stick together, falling toward the center of the pre-solar nebula. This caused gravity to pull even more into the center of the cloud that had more dense mass, and this is called gravitational contraction. While all of this was happening, the actions of molecules bumping into each other over and over caused this pre-solar nebula to flatten it into a spinning disk of dust and gas. And this is called a circumstellar disk or protoplanetary disk, right? And almost all of this material in the disk was collected toward the center, giving rise to our young sun. However, some of the particles in the spinning disk began colliding with each other, sticking together, forming larger and larger fragments. And the larger a fragment became, the more mass it had, and therefore the more gravitational pull it exerted, which in turn drew more and more material to it, the larger it became, and so on. This process is called accretion and resulted in the production of many planetesimals, which are basically small planets, and eventually the planets themselves. So while the young sun was starting to heat up in this middle of the protoplanetary disk, it warmed up the disk so much that nothing could stay solid close to it because it melted. And a little further out from the sun, stuff like metal and rock was able to cool enough to make solid materials for forming the planets. But it was still so hot that the molecules were often liquids or gases here on Earth, such as water, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and methane. They couldn't stick together to form a planet material, a planet basically. But these molecules could only really be added to planets that were a lot further from the sun, where it was cold enough for them to clump together, basically. So that's why we have gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn, which are different from rocky planets like Earth and Venus. Also, our Milky Way galaxy, as you might have guessed, is very big. So if we were to travel outside of the galaxy and look back at it, it would look like a big disk of dust and gas and stars with a big bulging sphere of stars near the middle. And this disk of the galaxy is about 100,000 light years in diameter, which means it takes light to travel. It takes like 100,000 years to travel from one side to the other. Our little solar system lies about 30,000 light years from the center. Just as moons orbit planets, planets orbit stars, star systems also orbit the center of the galaxy. So our own solar system is traveling through the galaxy at 500,000 miles per hour. And our very long orbit around this galaxy takes about 250 million years. But we're not alone out there. There are lots of other stars and other worlds in the galaxy. And so our best estimates right now are for how many stars there are in the Milky Way are about 100 to 400 billion with the B stars. So we've really only just begun finding exoplanets, of which we only know of like just over 1,000, I think 1,000 so far, maybe a couple thousand at this point. So it's highly likely that there's a lot more that we need to find out in terms of life's emergence, right? A lot of opportunities for life to emerge on other planets. So what was Earth like right after it had formed and came together? So as the planets were getting larger and larger, there was still a lot of diffuse gases and rocky particles present in the disk of materials around the sun. These rocky particles range in size from small rocks to very large ones considered asteroids. So they contain also different minerals, gases, water in the form of ice. And we know from modern studies of meteorites and asteroid and comets that some of these materials in our early solar system contained simple chemical compounds like formaldehyde, ammonia, and amino acids, organic compounds here. So these were synthesized at the time through chemical reactions in this giant molecular cloud and pre-solar nebula. So they were already kind of present there and available. So these young planets were continuously bombarded by these floating chunks of rock, delivering more gas, water, carbon-containing organic compounds to the Earth, which are critical components for the chemical reactions that give rise to life, right? And it was during this time of the heavy bombardment era, right, that the moon also formed. So the current theory is that there was a giant, collision that caused the formation of the moon. So these continual impacts that the Earth was experiencing removed so many asteroids and comets that the period of heavy bombardment slowed. The Earth began to finally settle down and change. So waters and gases like carbon dioxide were emitted from volcanoes to form the early atmosphere, and Earth was continuously cooling. A lot of that steam condensed and formed the global oceans, right? And in a really relatively short period of time after Earth had formed, it could have been habitable for life as we know it, and definitely at least contained the raw materials and energy needed for life right at the start of its formation. One thing I also wanted to mention is this kind of paradox called the faint young sun paradox, because back then, at the beginning of Earth's journey, right, the sunlight that it experienced was about 30% less because the sun was also younger. So we see in red here of the graph, the luminosity of the sun was a lot lower, was 30% lower. So this, will influence the temperature that an early Earth had. And so it was really important to understand, how did water and liquid water condense down into the ocean? And this is still a kind of debate among scientists, but basically one way to kind of understand how water was able to condense down was the higher levels of greenhouse gases that were present on the early Earth compared to now. So we see a expected temperature here, if Earth had no atmosphere versus if Earth had a present atmosphere. But in reality, scientists predict and hypothesize that the early Earth had a much higher amount of greenhouse gases, which warmed it and allowed that water to basically remain a liquid on Earth. So these greenhouse gases were coming from a degassing process and volcanic processes following the accretion of rocky particles to Earth's formation. But on Earth today, the carbon dioxide in the air is converted to oxygen by life, right? Photosynthetic organisms like plant and algae. On early Earth, there were no such organisms to do that. So the CO2 stayed in the atmosphere, contributing to that global warming and kept the liquid water on the surface despite a less luminous sun. So where could life have gotten started on Earth? Well, as the early Earth settled down from its formation and continued the evolution of its crust, oceans, atmospheres, many unique environments were taking place and shape. So beaches, icy areas, rocky surfaces, hot springs, lakes, lagoons, seas, volcanoes, and all the rest, including small hot water volcanoes on the Earth's floor called hydrothermal vents. And many of the raw materials of life, like small organic molecules, and by organic molecules, I really mean molecules that contain carbon, right? These were available in these environments, including, carbon dioxide and methane as well, which are also important for life. So they needed to also be in a place where they can constantly interact with each other in the presence of energy, which these hydrothermal vents are providing, right? In today's biology, enzymes help lower that activation energy needed to push a reaction to go forward, basically. Without it, it's going to take a long time, too long, for any reactions to take place. And so on prebiotic Earth, right, before life had gotten started, we don't have any of these enzymes, these biological enzymes to, keep chemical reactions going at a rapid and necessary pace. But instead, in order to get these small molecules to finally interact with each other, because again, these molecules need to interact with each other in the perfect way, with the perfect collision, the right amount of, speed needed to collide to have them react. In hydrothermal vent systems on the ocean floor, organic molecules in superheated water from below the crust would gush up in these chimney-like structures, the vents, and there would be an immediate interaction with cold ocean water. So groups of molecules could have gotten caught in tiny pores in the rocks of the chimney that may have emulated an early cell, perhaps. And these prebiotic chemical reactions could have given rise to life. And we'll see some different theories as well for biochemically how this could have happened. But this interaction of hot and cold water could also have produced a temperature gradient where the molecules could have also sorted themselves out and interacted in new ways, basically. I also wanted to add a picture here of stromatolites. So the earliest evidence of life on Earth came from fossils in Western Australia, and they're basically the formation of a growth layer of single-celled microbes like cyanobacteria, which are the photosynthesizing bacteria that produced oxygen on Earth and initially. And these stromatolites they're also made by present-day microbes, not just prehistoric ones. And the earliest fossils of microbes, rather than just their byproducts, allow us to look into and preserve these remains of what could have been like sulfur metabolizing bacteria and bacteria that used really unique types of metabolisms from early Earth. So how do we know if something is alive, right? The answer seems obvious and intuitive, but when you ask that question in the context of searching for life on other planets, it becomes difficult to pin down. In the unfamiliar environments of other planets, we need to figure out a way to distinguish between phenomena that is alive and that is not alive. And one way to address this is by considering how we describe living things on Earth today, right? The characteristics of all living things that we think, they all have in common. All life on Earth adheres to common biochemistry. That's for one, right? So all life on Earth uses DNA, RNA, and proteins, called also the central dogma. And they all have a structured organization in cells. So they're kind of like the main unit of organization, and they have membranes made up of, fatty phospholipids, as well as genetic information made up of nucleic acids such as DNA, RNA, and functions within and between cells are usually carried out by proteins, right? So that means organisms as distant as microbes versus like a fly versus an elephant versus humans, we all have the same biochemistry, all use DNA, proteins, RNA, and this also makes it easy to basically sequence the genome, what kind of genes that any microbial organism has, because not only do we share the same biochemistry, but most of life shares a lot of the same foundational genes that it needs to function. And so we can compare that and contrast between different forms of life because we all have it. So beyond this shared biochemistry, life also has some general traits as well. So we know that all life is highly ordered and structured, but not only do living things have cells and cellular structures, they also have larger scale structures like symmetry. We have bilateral symmetry, or starfish have like a radial symmetry, right? We also know that life needs to reproduce, whether it's sexually or asexually, as in vertebrates and plants have sexual reproduction as a general rule, and microbes such as yeast have asexual reproduction through like a binary fission in bacteria, for example. We also know that all life as we know it grows and develops in some way or form to reach mature states, whether that's like through the insect life cycle or plant life cycle, human life cycle. There's that development process from birth to, reproductive adulthood. All life also takes in and uses energy. I just included a picture of the ATP, ADP, and this is necessary to run all the cellular functions. And basically go against entropy. So the universe is constantly wanting to go in a higher chaotic state, a spontaneous state where everything is like metaphorically using up energy all the time and exploding, creating chaos on a molecular sense. And life is going in the opposite direction of the universe. So it seems. In reality, it may seem that life is anti-entropy, but in reality, by coupling ATP, for example, so by creating some potential energy and going against the entropy gradient, at the end of the day, we will ourselves and all life will have used more energy and released more energy rather than saved it. And so it's kind of tricky to explain, but life is still following the rules of thermodynamics and going toward an higher entropy and chaotic state. But what it's kind of doing is going slightly backwards before it goes towards in entropy. So life has created a lot of different mechanisms for this energy intake to turn food into a ATP form or any other energy storage system. And this can range from eating food like we do, where we're dependent on other organisms for food, or it could look like using sunlight, using the energy of the sun, or using the energy of particular chemicals that some microbes have learned to use. In any way, harnessing this energy to grow, develop, and other cellular functions is a key part of life as we know it. All life also exhibits homeostasis. So naturally, in the universe, things kind of want to diffuse and even out as much as possible. But our bodies, for example, are not evened out with our environment. Our bodies have homeostasis trying to preserve our internal state regardless of what external state there is. And we see this on a molecular level, we see this on a macro level. So we maintain our body temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what temperature it is, through all these feedback systems. On a molecular level, our cells might have a higher concentration of, let's say, salt than the outside of the cell, even though if it were non-life, those concentrations would be equal on the inside versus the outside of the cell. But whatever the cell's function it is, or it wants to do with salt, for example, it can control the concentration. And this is considered homeostasis, is creating a balanced internal environment, regardless of what is going on in the external environment. Similar to that, all life kind of responds to stimuli and is almost conscious on some sort of level because it needs to sense external stimuli, because all life, again, needs to eat, needs to find food and preserve itself from danger, right? Similarly, all living things adapt to external pressures. So maybe they won't have so much of a external stimuli reaction, but over generations, the survivors, the fittest, will survive depending on their adaptations to the environment. And so this is kind of more of a long-term reaction to the environment, depending on survival. And I've included kind of here a tree of life where we have bacteria, and then we also have archaea, another form of life. And that is also where we branched off in the eukarya domain of life. And this LUCA here is kind of and I'll talk about it later, the last universal common ancestor that we all share with all of life. Okay. So evolution overall is a huge defining characteristic of, of life. It's also important to consider exceptions, that there are some cases where we don't really see all of these characteristics being acquired, but we'd be pressed to call them abiotic, right? So perhaps things like viruses are dependent on another system to metabolize and to reproduce. But you could also argue that we are also completely dependent on other organisms to perpetuate ourselves, right? So humans are dependent on the food that we eat through other organisms, plant or animal organisms, to reproduce, right? And to spread our genetic material, which is exactly the same thing that viruses do. So viruses are not self-sustaining in that way, where they require a host to replicate and to create their own proteins and machinery and basically rebuild them. But you could argue that humans and other heterotrophs do the same thing, right? Another exception would be prions. I actually have a picture here, right here. So we have viruses and prions. That prions are basically disease-causing proteins that have developed a contagious nature because of their kind of unfolded, like misfolded structure that can cause other proteins to misfold and in the same way, right? And this can be transferred through organisms and can be very contagious, like through mad cow disease, which is why you should never eat brains of any animal, because this is how it's passed, like through brains. I would also like to highlight here NASA's definition of life, right? Because NASA is out here looking for other forms of life on different planets. So it's really important that they have an idea of exactly what they're looking for. And their definition is that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, right? Where it's survival of the fittest. And there's that transfer of knowledge between generations. Why is water so important for life as we know it? Well, all life on planet Earth needs water to survive, right? Some life can live with very little water in extremely dry places, but they still need water. And as we strive to find life beyond Earth, it's important to consider what life on Earth tells us about where to look, right? And so, why, in the first place, is water so important for life? Well, water supports cell functions, and all organisms are made up of cells, as we discussed, from microbes to large animals. And all of life's functions are completed within these cells, where chemical reactions need to take place to grow, to gain energy, and get rid of waste. Water, in particular, is a liquid that allows the chemistry of life to take place. It's a polar molecule, allowing for other molecules to be dissolved. And because of this, it's called the universal solvent. This is critical for life to take place, but also it has some other properties, such as the ability to remain a liquid over very large temperature ranges, as well as having a very high heat capacity, which makes it resistant to temperature changes, kind of buffering the extreme temperatures on Earth, whether hot or cold. Water is also very available throughout the universe, as hydrogen is the most plentiful element in the universe, and 70% of the surface of the Earth is covered by water, but overall, there's still a lot of water throughout the whole solar system, including on Mars in earlier times. But currently, Mars has a lot of frozen water underneath its surface. Comets also contain mostly water ice, and there's lots of other moons in the solar system that are also made of that contain ice, as well as liquid oceans such as Europa and Enceladus. But water also has an interesting property in regards to its density. when solid, right? So solid ice is less dense than liquid, which protects the aquatic life during cold condition and floats on tops. Otherwise, it would have been possible for like water systems to liquid systems to have completely frozen, let's say from the bottom up, and be unsustainable for any life to survive. Additionally, water has very special adhesion and cohesion properties, which for plant life especially is very important as it allows the transfer of water with nutrients through capillary action across like the stem, for example, and is also creates like a turgor pressure and basically maintains the pressure in plant cell between plant cell walls. In order to better understand where life could exist beyond Earth, we need to consider what living things on Earth have in common on a molecular or biochemical lens, right? For instance, all living things on Earth need certain chemical elements to survive. And if we look at all the organisms on Earth, from microbes living in hot springs to orchids to blue whales, we see that the fundamental building blocks of life are all the same. All living things primarily contain carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we sometimes abbreviate these as CHNOPS, and this could be pronounced schnapps. Similar to cooking, schnapps elements are very much like ingredients for a recipe where you need to have the right ingredients to make the dish. But given how common these elements are, why don't we see alien life all over the place? Well, having the right ingredients is only the first step. And the other part is putting all those ingredients together in the right way. And an important step in figuring out if other living things are out there is finding, planets or different systems where these elements are present and have come together in the right way. So investigating life on Earth has shown us that all living things need certain elements for cellular processes, growth, metabolism. For example, these elements are known to be a part of every living thing. They make up proteins, fats, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates that life uses. But there's also lots of other elements like metals that are needed by living things as well, trace elements. And these ingredients for life work like a recipe. You have to put them together in the right way. Another thing I'd like to highlight is how difficult it is for polymers to develop on their own, right, in an abiogenic fashion without, proteins made by life already intervening and aiding in the replication of DNA, for example, or the development of new proteins, where, for example, RNA plays a big role through tRNA and rRNA to develop new proteins and synthesize new proteins. For polymers, very, very long polymers that are made up of monomeric components. For example, DNA is a polymer, RNA is a polymer, proteins are polymers, and that requires a very specific coming together of monomers in the right orientation, in the right order. For example, DNA is made up of dinucleotides that come together in a very specific way to, spread and perpetuate information and acts as a blueprint for RNA and proteins. So that is just going to be a big limitation to keep in mind is not only do we need to have all of the right elements, but all of the monomeric components ready to be assembled into polymers, which may not be very stable, right? Because again, the universe is headed toward entropy, and it is way easier for these components and molecules to stay in the least organized fashion possible, which would be, again, in their most basic components in monomeric form. So what are the sources of life's building blocks outside of Earth? Well, when Earth and other planets were still forming the solar nebula about 4.5 billion years ago, not all the material ended up in the planets and all the moons. There's still a bunch of debris left over, ranging from the size of, microscopic size, all the way to miles across. So these became like asteroids and comets that are still in our solar system. And they've continued to rain down on Earth's surface. We can use the word meteoroid to describe these pieces of space stuff that fall into Earth. And once in our atmosphere, these pieces of rock or ice will burn up and produce that streak of light, which we would call a shooting star, or meteor. So sometimes these chunks of material are also so big that they could reach the ground, they can hit the ground. In this case, we would call them a meteorite. Meteorites of all shapes and sizes have impacted Earth, and investigations of the material of these meteorites show that the chemical elements needed for life can be found inside. And these contain the SNOPS elements, the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And the scientists who do research on meteorites have also found those building blocks that we've talked about, like very complex sugars and amino acids that are the building blocks for proteins. Research on the connection between these materials from space and the presence of life on Earth need to continue in order to better understand the history of life on Earth and to figure out if there could be life elsewhere. Okay, so how did life first emerge on Earth? Well, one of the greatest mysteries about life in our planet is how and when it started. Life appears to have been here for a very long time. Using the tools of science, we've learned that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And as old as Earth is, we found evidence that living things have been around for almost as long as a planet has been here. So this tells us that life may have started on Earth as far back as 4 billion years ago, maybe before then. Life started so long ago that it's really hard to know when exactly it started, and there's still scientists trying to figure that out, looking at those ancient fossils of stromatolites, or sometimes they'll look at isotopes of elements like carbon trapped in old rocks to see if they imply biological activity. And if they find such evidence, they can also use other information from the rocks to figure out what kind of environment was available for potential living things to use and thrive off of. There's also some scientists that are running experiments in laboratories to see how these basic building blocks of life can come together and make living things. For example, some lab experiments can be set up to figure out what conditions would be necessary for cell membranes to form without life. And it turns out that some molecules can come together to make pockets just like cells, right, under the right conditions. For example, these, what we consider micelles, which are kind of protocells of lipids coming together and forming kind of a sphere. But outside of studying clues that we can find in the rocks and running experiments in labs, we can also use computer simulations to test our idea about how life might have started. All of these kinds of research projects have helped us learn a little bit more about how life may have come about on our planet, but there's still a lot of, many scientists agree that the earliest life would have needed a good amount of water, the fundamental SNOPS elements to make organic molecules, and finally, some way to concentrate simple organic molecules that would be necessary for more complex biological processes. And these can happen in tidal zones in the ocean, in little droplets of water that get sprayed onto the atmosphere from ocean waves, where hydrothermal vents form on the ocean floor, or maybe even in small ponds or lakes when they dry up. It would also have been necessary to bring these molecules together in just the right way to make some chemical reactions more likely to occur. It turns out that some minerals, including pyrites, made up of iron and sulfur and many clays, alluding to this clay world theory, are really good at orienting molecules in a way that causes them to react together. Life as we know it, again, is based on cells. So an environment where life emerges would need to be include naturally made containers with an inside and some outside. And it turns out these little enclosures, just like cells, these little lipid enclosures I was telling you about, can form without life's involvement at all. So it could occur abiotically, right? And depending on the chemistry of the fluid involved, these non-living cells can form again automatically. So all of the considered locations and potential places where life could have started are also places that currently have living things thriving in them, and many of them are considered to be extremophiles. So, investigations on the genetics of known organisms on Earth has suggested that the earliest life might have been thermophilic and adapted to hotter environments, which has caused a lot of people to suspect that hydrothermal systems may be important for the formation of life. As we learn more about how life on Earth may have started, it helps us to better understand the places we should look on other worlds in our solar system or in other solar systems if we want to look for alien life. For instance, the possibility of hydrothermal vents to be active and possible sites of living processes in the oceans of Europa and Enceladus makes these two moons really important places for us to study. Uncovering the origin of life on Earth is a pretty big mystery to try to solve, and we may never actually figure it out, but we're still getting closer and closer to understanding how it may have happened here on Earth and possibly other worlds as well. Perhaps the emergence of life on a world isn't just something that happens on it, but rather to it. Some people suspect that the development of life is a natural process that occurs for many worlds in the universe, but we can't test that idea or figure out how common life may be until we've discovered other life on other planets and find out we're not alone. One other interesting place of study in the origin of life research is whether or not there was only one or maybe more origins of life on Earth. So when we discuss the common ancestor of life as we know it, we again refer to this common ancestor as LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor, but that doesn't mean that LUCA was a single organism or even a single type of organism, but potentially a group of organisms who happened to be the most successful out of a larger group that was present on ancient Earth. There may have been several competing forms of life, perhaps all fairly similar, but that's what made LUCA special, was that it was able to outcompete other forms of life for resources and food at some point in time in Earth's history. I'd also like you to think about, what if there was a new modern attempt of the origin of life here on Earth, and what would be the potential problems that that new form of life would have to face? So the lack of earlier fossil evidence makes pinpointing the time of life's origin pretty difficult, if not impossible. But starting out with the theories for how life might have risen, in the 1920s, Russian scientists Oparin and Haladin both separately proposed what's now called the Oparin-Haladin hypothesis, that life on Earth could have arisen step by step from non-living matter to living matter through a process called gradual chemical evolution. And this has really set up the foundation for how we think of the origin of life today. So both Oparin and Haladin thought that early Earth had a reducing atmosphere, meaning an oxygen poor atmosphere that tended to donate electrons. And under these conditions, they suggested that simple inorganic molecules may have reacted to form building blocks like amino acids and nucleotides that could have accumulated in the oceans, making a primordial soup. And these building blocks could have combined in further reactions, forming larger, more complex molecules, such as polymers. These polymers could have assembled into units, structures that were capable of sustaining and then replicating themselves, because that's key. Oparin thought that these might have been colonies of proteins that clustered together and carried out metabolism, while Haladin suggested that macromolecules became enclosed in membranes to make cell-like structures. The details of these models are likely not quite correct. For instance, geologists now think that the early Earth's atmosphere was not reducing, and it's unclear whether these pools at the edge of the oceans were likely a site of the origin of life. But the basic idea of a stepwise, spontaneous formation of simple, then more complex life, then self-sustaining biological molecules is really at the core of what most origin of life hypotheses are today, from inorganic compounds to building blocks in a gradual fashion. Then in 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey did an experiment to test Oparin and Haladin's ideas. They found that organic molecules could be spontaneously produced under the right reducing conditions thought to resemble those of early Earth. Miller and Urey built a closed system containing a heated pool of water and a mixture of gases that they thought would be abundant in the atmosphere of early Earth. To simulate the lightning that might have provided energy for chemical reactions in early Earth's atmosphere, they sent sparks of electricity through their experimental system. After letting the experiment run for a week, Miller and Urey found that various types of amino acids, sugars, lipids, and other organic molecules had formed. Large complex molecules like DNA and proteins were missing, but Miller and Urey showed that at least some of the building blocks of these molecules could spontaneously form from simple compounds. So, how meaningful were these results? Well, scientists now think that the atmosphere of early Earth was a lot more different than Miller and Urey's setup was, again, not reducing and not necessarily rich in ammonia and methane. So it's doubtful that they had an accurate simulation of early Earth, but from these experiments, it seems reasonable to imagine that at least some of life's building blocks could have formed abiotically on early Earth. However, exactly how and under what conditions still remains an open question. So how could monomers like amino acids or nucleotide have assembled into polymers or actual macromolecules? Well, in cells today, polymers are put together by enzymes, but again, they didn't have enzymes before life had developed, right? So it's kind of a chicken or egg problem. You need proteins to make proteins, right? You need DNA to make DNA. And monomers may have been able to spontaneously form polymers under the right conditions. And Sidney Fox and his colleagues in the 1950s found that if amino acids were heated in the absence of water, they could link to form proteins. Fox suggested that on early Earth, ocean water carrying amino acids could have splashed onto a hot surface like a lava flow, boiling away the water and leaving behind a protein. This kind of alludes to the metabolism first world that we see here. Okay, so we basically have two hypotheses for how life originated on a biochemical level. So we either have the RNA world hypothesis or the metabolism first hypothesis. Additional experiments in the 1990s showed that RNA molecules can be linked together when exposed to a clay surface, like the Smont-Morillonite, and this clay acts as a catalyst to form an RNA polymer. More broadly, clay and other mineral surfaces may have played a key role in the formation of polymers, acting as supports or catalysts. Polymers floating in a solution may have broken down quickly or hydrolyzed quickly, supporting a surface-attached model rather than polymers just free floating. If we imagine that polymers were able to form on early Earth, this still leaves us with the question of how polymers would have become self-replicating or self-perpetuating, meeting the most basic criteria for life. This is an area in which there are many ideas, but still very little certainty about the correct answer. The genes first hypothesis is one possibility where the first life forms were self-replicating nucleic acids such as RNA or DNA, and that other elements like a metabolic network were added later on to this basic system. And this is called genes first hypothesis or replication first hypothesis. Many scientists who subscribe to this hypothesis think that RNA, but not DNA, was likely the first genetic material. This is known as the RNA world hypothesis, and scientists favor RNA over DNA because, firstly, RNA can carry information, but also act as a catalyst, whereas we don't really know of DNA acting like a catalyst. And the metabolism first hypothesis, alternatively, suggests that a self-sustaining network of metabolic reactions may have been the first form of simple life. These networks might have formed near undersea thermal vents. In this scenario, initially simple pathways may have produced molecules that acted like catalysts and then built on top of that complexity. Eventually, the metabolic networks may have been able to build very large molecules like proteins and nucleic acids. And formation of individuals enclosed by membranes, so individual cells, would have been a much later step. And again, this is kind of an idea of what an early cell might have looked like, that protocell, where the internal environment is being sustained and maintained outside of the surrounding external environment. it's unlikely that phospholipids would have been present under the conditions which the first cell forms. So how did life become something that competes for resources and evolves? Well, we know that evolution is how life adapts to its environment over time, and this adaptation is driven by variability, by competition between populations of organisms. Evolution allows for the most successful traits within a population to continue on through reproduction. And the most successful traits aren't always the ones that seem to be the best. We have good reason to think that this process of selection for certain traits has been around as long as living things have been around. But it's possible that the evolution of chemical systems was one necessary step for the origin and development of life on Earth that precedes even the development of cells. If that's the case, where do you think these early evolving systems might have been found? If we're curious to understand how life may evolve outside of Earth, there's a certain type of evolution that can give us hints as to how alien life may look, how it may evolve, and how it may strategize against similar environmental stressors. For example, convergent evolution is the type of evolution that develops or adapts traits that are independent of each other. So there are traits that have evolved independently of each other through different lineages. So we have, just in general, eyes have developed and emerged many times separately, and specifically the same type of camera eye that we find in vertebrates is the same type of eye that squid independently evolved to have. We also see that wings have evolved independently many times in dinosaurs, birds, bats, insects, and fish, all serving the same function, but I mean, slightly different approaches, but of course, an overall, similar solution. We also see that the Tasmanian devil over here resembles very closely a dog, right? While in actuality is a marsupial from Australia. We also see in plants that cacti and this type of succulent, the euphorbia, have developed very thick stems that allow it to preserve and retain water, right? And if you are interested in some more examples, I highly recommend The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy. It is a really great read all about convergent evolution, what alien life may evolve to look like. So we were just talking about some macro scale traits, but we can also apply this onto a molecular level. We see that antifreeze proteins have evolved separately and independently in fish and insects to resist very, very cold conditions. So while they have slightly different proteins and protein structures for these jobs, so we have the fish here, we have insects, fungi, plants. The protein structure is slightly different, but again, the function is the same. So it's kind of considered the same solution for the same problem. And this just indicates that given the constraints of physics, we will end with a similar trait, and we can use these universal traits to predict what extraterrestrial life could look like given a particular set of environmental stressors. All right, so that concludes the end of the lecture, but here are some activities for you guys to check out. We have the Miller-Urey simulation here where you can kind of play around and try to create those building blocks of life. We have kind of an interactive website that you can go through here as well. There's also this really cool comic strip, which maybe we'll assign for a future lecture, but this is pretty well done, I would say, and kind of goes through all the science in a visual way. This site has a little bit more, this article kind of more in depth about kind of biology and geology and their role in the origin of life. And this one is also an interactive site, building a protocell, and has some more videos and information
Vesicles formed from fatty acids are extremely stable.
with animations. All right, thank you again for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed today's lecture. Please remember to add your reflection for today's lecture, and we'll be seeing you on Tuesday. Bye.